Let's get to our top story this morning. President Trump once again grew angry at Ukraine's president on social media yesterday, accusing Zelensky of, quote, inflammatory statements that will only prolong the war with Russia. In a lengthy message, President Trump criticized Zelensky for saying Ukraine would not recognize the Crimean Peninsula as Russian territory. Trump went on to call the situation dire for Ukraine while adding the United States, Ukraine, and Russia are very close to a deal and, quote, the man with no cards to play should now finally get it done. It's painful. Hours after the president spoke about the negotiations and was asked directly if the deal on the table includes officially recognizing the Crimean Peninsula as Russian territory.
I will say that I think Russia is ready, and a lot of people said Russia wanted to go for the whole thing. And I think we have a deal with Russia. We have to get a deal with Zelensky, and I hope that Zelensky, I thought it might be easier to deal with Zelensky. So far it's been harder, but that's okay. It's all right. But I think we have a deal with both.
And if I may, this deal that you have with Russia, does it include recognizing Russia's sovereignty over Crimea?
Well, everything is good. Look, I just want to see the war end. I don't care. If they're both happy, they both sign an agreement. I have no favorites. I don't want to have any favorites. I want to have a deal done.
More on those remarks in a moment. They followed a series of developments in peace talks that began with the announcement that Secretary of State Marco Rubio would not attend what were supposed to be high-level meetings in London with European negotiating teams. Instead, Trump's envoy for Ukraine and Russia, retired Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, met with Ukrainian officials. Those Ukrainian officials met separately with teams from the UK, Germany, and France. Tomorrow, presidential envoy Steve Witkoff is set to meet with Vladimir Putin for the fourth time. All of this comes as Russia continues to bombard Ukrainian cities. 9 people were killed in the capital of Kyiv overnight, and more than 70 were injured by a massive Russian missile and drone strike. So, Jonathan Lemire, obviously Russia, Vladimir Putin emboldened by having a new president who they view as very favorable to his approach here and his war aims. But if you go back to what President Trump said, again, explicitly attacking our ally, attacking President Zelensky, and again, putting all of the burden, all of the onus on the victim of this invasion 3 years ago. Where does this go from here? Are they setting a pretext to walk away completely from all of this? Because if you look at what we've had reported out from this apparent peace deal, it gives everything Russia could have ever wanted when it started this war.
Let's start right there. The White House, the Trump administration has asked Russia to give up nothing. There's been no compromise, no concession requested from the Trump team. He has a number of times even blamed Zelensky for the start of this war, which is preposterous. There's a sovereign nation Russia invaded in February of 2022. We know from Marco Rubio last week saying that the United States might be willing to walk away from peace talks if a deal can't get done soon. We had J.D. Vance yesterday, sort of while on overseas, spelling out, and we'll get into the details in a moment, but conditions for a ceasefire, for peace, which would involve Ukraine giving up Crimea. And that's the sticking point right now. This is the Ukrainians are simply not going to recognize Russian territory. Now, there's going to be dispute over it. There's certainly been sense even during while President Biden was in office, whether Ukraine really had the ability to retake Crimea. But that is simply not going to be, you don't start the negotiations there. And that's where the Trump team seems to want, which is such a huge concession from Zelensky, also having to say we'll never join NATO while asking nothing of Russia, continuing to in many ways, as Witkoff has done over Vladimir Putin, siding with Moscow day in, day out in this conflict.
And Lemire, as you mentioned, while traveling in India yesterday, Vice President J.D. Vance repeated the administration's warning about the U.S. walking away from negotiations between Russia and Ukraine if a deal isn't reached soon.
Well, I'm going to echo something Secretary Rubio said, which is, look, We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process. We've engaged in an extraordinary amount of diplomacy, of on-the-ground work. We've really tried to understand things from the perspective of both the Ukrainians and the Russians. What do Ukrainians care the most about? What do the Russians care the most about? And I think that we've put together a very fair proposal.
All right, and before we get to our experts, tell me what you're thinking right now.
I mean, even as the vice president said there, he said we're trying to understand each side's perspective. Trying to understand the Russia's perspective. We know what their perspective is. They invaded a sovereign nation.
They want to seize territory, and Trump wants to give it to them.
Yeah,
that is the bottom line.
Doesn't seem much up for interpretation.
The Wall Street Journal editorial board has a new piece entitled "Trump's Ukraine Ultimatum." It reads in part, quote, "Mr. Trump's current offer looks more like an ultimatum than grounds for a durable peace. Mr. Trump is angry that Ukraine won't accept a deal that legitimizes Russia's occupation of Crimea, as if this is a minor map revision. The U.S. refusal to credit territory seized by invasion is a principle intended to deter future marauders. Letting Russia keep its navy in Crimea is a threat to Europe as much as to Ukraine. A peace or even an armistice worth the name requires compromise on both sides. But Mr. Trump has applied pressure only on Ukraine. Mr. Trump likes to say Ukraine doesn't have the cards, but it does have one ace. The president won't be able to abandon Ukraine without paying a heavy political price. Mr. Trump can still salvage a deal in Ukraine, but the current final settlement offer looks like it would set up Mr. Putin to win the war now or later. The world's rogues will notice, and Mr. Trump's headaches will have only begun. Willie.
You know, the New York Times reminds us this morning that now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, then Senator Rubio, just 3 years ago, co-sponsored legislation, an amendment to prohibit the United States from ever recognizing any Russian claim over parts of Ukraine that it has seized, which includes Crimea. It's saying exactly what the Wall Street Journal just said. It sets a terrible precedent. China's watching. Taiwan is watching. On and on. Let's bring in staff writer at The Atlantic, Ann Applebaum, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy, Ian Brzezinski. Good morning to you both. Ian, I'll start with you and just read a quote from President Zelensky in reaction to this apparent proposal, this peace deal, as the United States is calling it. Quote, "There is nothing to talk about." That's from President Zelensky. So where do you see us going from here?
Thanks. You know, let me put this in historical context. I mean, what we see President Trump doing is basically forcing Europe and Ukraine to make concessions of territory and sovereignty of the likes that we haven't seen since the 1938 Munich Agreement, when Neville Chamberlain forced Czechoslovakia to give up the Sudetenland to Hitler, an agreement that unleashed the violence of World War II. It's something we haven't seen since the Yalta Accord, an accord that enabled Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin to impose a sphere of influence over Central and Eastern Europe, a domination that lasted for 5 decades. And the tragedy of this is it's totally unnecessary, because Trump likes to say he has all the cards. And in fact, the transatlantic community, led by the United States, does have all the cards. We have some $55 trillion in GDP among NATO nations. That's about half of the world's GDP against Russia's $2 trillion. The alliance spends about $1.5 trillion on defense annually against Russia's $200 billion. That's a factor of 10. It's amazing that the West, led by Trump, isn't forcing or enabling Ukraine to end this war on its terms. And it's a tragedy. You know, Biden failed to leverage that power against Putin. But Trump is even weaker than Biden. Not only is he forcing Ukraine into concessions, he's setting up dynamics that history has taught us will set up the pretext for a wider and more dangerous war. So Trump is not leveraging American power very effectively. He's proving weak, and he's undermining not just Ukraine, but our own interests in having enduring peace and stability in Europe.
So, Ann, if we're reaching back to Neville Chamberlain, reaching back to Yalta, not a good sign, obviously. I'm curious what you make of what we've seen just in the last 24 hours, the statements from the president, Secretary of State Marco Rubio declining to show up for those negotiations in London, all against the backdrop of the enduring question of more than a decade, which is why? Why does President Trump, why does he always, as a reflex, side with Vladimir Putin and Russia?
So I'll start by saying, agreeing with Ian to say that Putin has never given up his main goal in Ukraine. His goal is to remove Ukrainian sovereignty, to change the nature of the Ukrainian government, to make sure that Ukraine does not ever integrate with Europe, to make sure that it stays inside some kind of Russian sphere of influence, preferably, maybe even sharing sovereignty with Russia. So he has never, ever said that he has given that up. Sometimes he'll change his language a little bit, but he maintains that all the time. And so even in all these negotiations, they keep talking about how, they've been talking and talking and they're tired of the negotiations and so on. They've never, ever put any pressure on Russia to change it. And you're right to ask why is it that Trump continues to support this? And the only answer I can see is that Trump admires people who have unlimited power. He admires people who don't have checks and balances. He admires people who simply exercise violence, who use it without restraint. He sees that Putin does that, and he admires it.